Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I'm delighted to be able to be with you today on our Great Books course. As you all know, we are now blending our graduate and our undergraduate courses in the spirit of what we call a one-room schoolhouse, so that we have students from all the degree levels taking similar courses. The Great Books is a required course for all BA students, and I want to in particular welcome Madhushika and the Sri Lankans today. We have a very strong contingent from Sri Lanka, and in many ways the choice of this book today was chosen in honor of our students from Sri Lanka, as you'll discover in a few minutes. But I just wanted to say a few words about the nature of our Great Books course. Most of our courses, as you experience with, say, transformational leadership, are 15 weeks long, and each week the students go through various modules and quizzes and assignments as you would in many universities. The Great Books course, however, is very different because it has a different motive and organization. We meet once a month, and we cover one book every 2 months, so we spend 2 months on each book. And the reason why we do that is because the books that we select are very deep books. They're great books. They're books that have endured over time. They're books that have a transformational impact on the reader. They're books that speak to different cultures, whether you're from Asia or whether you're from Africa, Europe, North or South America. What makes a great book is that it speaks to you, whatever your culture and whatever your language, and therefore it goes deep. And material and information and experiences that go deep, rather than the superficialities of knowledge that just kind of fill the mind, take time to incubate and to nurture. So when we contemplate a great book, we want you to be thinking very deeply about its content. So even though you're not going to class every week on a regular basis as you're used to, particularly at the undergraduate level, and you're only meeting once a month on the content of a great work, we're hopeful that you'll spend the time reading the book, possibly reading commentaries, other points of view, participating in our Facebook page, which you all have access to, and really using this as an opportunity to develop what Plato, the great Plato, the Greek philosopher Plato, calls the enlargement of your soul. And so Mark Ryan and Will Tagle and Georgie Szabo and I were all faculty at the Wisdom School of Graduate Studies here at Ubiquity University, and several of us are also faculty in the undergraduate and MBA programs as well. But as all of you students in whatever degree levels you come from, participate in Ubiquity University courses. Again, you'll be participating in courses that are drawing from the entire university. So there will be an opportunity to interact undergraduate and graduate level, and will be thereby very much enriched in our dialogue one with the other as we contemplate some of the great issues that are raised by these great books. Today, I am particularly pleased to introduce to you a book that has been profoundly influential on my life by Lama Anarika Govinda. If I had what they call in Buddhism, a root guru, a basic teacher, I would say that Anarika Govinda would be my basic teacher, my root teacher, because his masterwork, The Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism, has been profoundly influential in my spirituality. And his work that we'll discuss and contemplate today, The Way of the White Clouds, which is the story of his pilgrimage to Tibet in the 1930s, is one of the most exquisite travel journals and spiritual narratives that I have ever read. And so I want to just share with you some of the thoughts. And for those of you who don't know me, this is a particularly important material to me personally, because I was born in West China in 1951. And this was the time, as you all remember, of the beginning of the reign of Mao Zedong and the Red Army in China. He took over and announced the revolution in Tiananmen Square in October 1, 1949. My parents were missionaries way in the far western Tibet, China, right along the borders of Tibet. And in fact, they had gone there in 1946, intending to go to Tibet as missionaries. And they'd been stopped at the border because of the war. And so I was born in a little village with no running water or electricity, with city gates that were closed every night, a little town called Hui Li. And I didn't know it at the time, but the Chinese army had been massing in that area in 1950, 1951 for the initial invasion of Tibet in 1951. And my parents witnessed massive executions. They estimate that about 10% of the entire population was liquidated by the Chinese communists. And I just raised this because this is a point that I'll get to in a minute as we consider Anarika Govinda's narration of his time in Tibet, because he saw Tibet at its most pristine. And then he witnessed Tibet as it was literally forced into a Holocaust of equal destructiveness to everything that the Jews experienced in the Holocaust in Europe just a decade before. And so his journey and the way he describes Tibet is of profound importance for, I think, the world to understand as we think about the current realities in the world. Anarika Govinda was not born with that name. He was born with the name Hoffman. His father was German. He was born in Germany in 1896. His mother was Bolivian. And so he shared from birth a dual heritage. He came from a family of some wealth. His mother's family had become wealthy through the tin mining in Bolivia. And his father was of sort of lower aristocratic class there in southern Germany. And the young boy was actually very weak in his constitution and was sick a lot when he was a child, and had pleurisy and was bedridden for uh, sustained periods of time. And when he was about 14 years old, he began to meditate. And this came as a surprise to his parents, but he was instinctively drawn to Buddhism. And he began to meditate very deeply. And then as a late teenager, in his early 20s, he wrote his first book. And it was called The Fundamental Ideas of Buddhism and the Relationship to the Concept of God. He studied Pali at the University of Naples and started his spiritual development trying to synthesize the Eastern notion of the world with the Western theistic notion of God. And he traveled very extensively then as he got better in his 20s, and he traveled in North Africa. He went back to Bolivia and spent a number of months there. And his parents almost talked him into becoming an engineer in the tin mines in Bolivia. And thank God, thank for history, that he decided not to do that. And instead, he went to Sri Lanka. This is the reason why I wanted to start with this book, to honor our Sri Lankan students. He traveled to Sri Lanka after the First World War was over, basically in the 1920s. And he took vows as a Theravada Buddhist. And he lived right outside of Kandy for 2 decades. And then he was invited to a conference in Darjeeling in northern India to give a lecture on Theravada Buddhism. And he went up there, and it was while he was in Darjeeling that he met a Tibetan Buddhist Rinpoche that had a very profound effect on his thinking and his life. Even though he had taken vows as the Theravada Buddhist down in Sri Lanka, he never took final vows. And the reason was that he found the Theravada Buddhist tradition too rigorous and too complicated. And there were just, as he said, too many rules. And that's true of many monastic traditions. And so he was captivated while he was in India with the mysticism of what they called at that time Lamism, and began to really delve into the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Vajrayana tradition, as opposed to the Theravada tradition. And then he took the vows of a Tibetan Buddhist. In Tibetan Buddhism, unlike in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, you can choose whether you want to marry or not marry. And in Anarika Govinda's case, he decided to marry. And then he began to travel throughout Tibet in the 1930s and early 1940s with his wife. And The Way of the White Clouds, the book that we're going to contemplate today, this month, is the story of his pilgrimage. And I'd like to dwell on this now, and I'll read a few passages from the book and then basically comment on them. And then when I complete my remarks, we will have Mark Ryan give comments, and then we'll open it up to all the students to comment. I may call on a few of you because at Ubiquity University, we very much emphasize dialogue and really living in the questions. And oftentimes when you think of school, you think of going to a class and taking notes and listening to what the teacher says and then taking a test on that, and you're rewarded by how well you memorize information. But at Ubiquity, we take a very different approach. For us, the teacher is just, an advanced student. And those of you, I'm sure Mark would agree, teachers in some ways learn the most, because in preparing their lectures, they really have to study hard the material. So consider me not your professor. Consider me another student, literally, that is passionate about this subject and has read the book, in my case, several times, and just wants to share with you his reflections. But your reflections are just as important as mine. And that's why I want to encourage all of you to engage in dialogue. We want to know what you think. We want you to share your views and opinions on our Facebook page. And then in your term paper, at the end of the course, we want you to just share what you've learned, how you've been moved, how it's deepened your spiritual perception of yourself and the world, in the spirit of collegiality and in dialogue. So with that as a preface, I'd like to turn to the book, and I want to read a few passages on selected themes. And what I want to do, just so you have a sense of the movement of my remarks over the next couple of months, this lecture today will be on Tibet and Mount Kailash and his pilgrimage to Mount Kailash and his comments on the importance of Tibet in the world and why Tibet and the Dalai Lama is so extraordinarily present around the world. And then next month, we're going to get into the whole question of reincarnation and the transmigration of the soul, and Anarika Govinda's notion of Buddhist consciousness. So today we're going to just begin almost at a physical level with his descriptions of Tibet, and in particular Mount Kailash, because we're preparing a pilgrimage of our own to Mount Kailash this August, which I am very, very excited about, and invite all of you to join. Even though we're full, probably fit in one or two more before we're done. I want to describe Mount Kailash, and then again, as I say, next month we'll go deeper into consciousness, reincarnation, and the transmigration of the soul. So beginning with Tibet, in his foreword, and I want to read a few paragraphs because of the exquisite beauty of Govinda's use of language. And that's one of the things that makes a great book great. You think of the Bhagavad Gita, you think of the Dhammapada, and Plato's Republic. Part of the reason why books endure over time is because they're so exquisitely beautiful in their use of language. And in his foreword on page 21, if you have the same copy of the book that I do, he says, "What is happening in Tibet is symbolical for the fate of humanity. As on a gigantically raised stage, we witness the struggle between two worlds, which may be interpreted according to the standpoint of the spectator, either as the struggle between the past and the future, between backwardness and progress, belief and science, superstition and knowledge, or as the struggle between spiritual freedom and material power. The struggle between spiritual freedom and material power, between the wisdom of the heart and the knowledge of the brain, between the dignity of the human individual and the herd instinct of the mass, between the faith in the higher destiny of humanity through inner development and the belief in material prosperity through an ever-increasing production of goods. In Tibet, we witness the tragedy of a peaceful people without political ambitions and with the sole desire to be left alone, being deprived of its freedom and trampled underfoot by a powerful neighbor in the name of progress, which as ever must serve as a cover for all the brutalities of the human race. The living present is sacrificed to the Moloch of the future. The organic connection with a faithful, fruitful past is destroyed for the chimera of a machine-made prosperity. You know, every human life is sacred. Every people in the world are precious. And at the same time, there are certain events, certain individuals that somehow rise above the mass and in their experience become symbolical for all of humanity. You know, one thinks of Jesus of Nazareth in the West, and that life became symbolical of the West. And out of that emerged the Christian religion. One thinks of the Buddha in the East and how the life of Siddhartha 2,500 years ago somehow became symbolical of all of humanity in the East. And out of that came the great religion of Buddhism. One thinks of the Jews in the West. And I would suggest to you to consider the Tibetans in the East as two peoples that have had a very interesting odyssey that in some ways has become crucial for the understanding of humanity itself and the various traditions around which our histories revolve. And I think what we saw with the Jews during the Second World War and the Holocaust is what we saw was the sin, I would call it, of anti-Semitism that originated right at the beginning of the Christian religion. The stain on the heart of Christianity was its anti-Semitism that festered in the Western European mind until the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s. And when Hitler came to power, he exacted what he called the final solution to the Jewish problem. And that culminated in the Holocaust. And 6 million Jews and 1 million gays and artists and gypsies were intentionally executed. And altogether 17 million people were executed in addition to the carnage of the Second World War by the Nazis in one of the most horrendous acts of evil in world history. Contemporary of Hitler was Mao Zedong in China. And when he came to power in October 1, 1949, he embarked on a policy of progress in China that culminated in the deaths of between 70 and 100 million people. I want everybody to think about that for a second. Stalin in the Soviet Union was responsible, it's estimated, for between 25 and 40 million people executed, not through war, not through accident of fate and circumstance, but through a deliberate state policy of executing people who were considered undesirable. And that's what happened in Tibet. And the extraordinary synchronicity between the Tibetan experience and the Jewish experience, both of them going through a Holocaust of equal destructiveness. When Mao Zedong came into China beginning in 1951 with the armies that in part were camped in the region in which I was born, he proceeded to systematically liquidate as much of the Tibetan culture and people as he possibly could. 1 million people were massacred. Of the 6,250 temples and monasteries, 6,000 of them were razed to the ground. And in a decapitation of a people, the Chinese communists basically began forced migrations of Chinese into the Tibetan region with a deliberate state policy of extinction, of genocide. And so when Anarika Govinda writes as he does, that's as if watching Tibet, we're on a stage, we witness the struggle between two worlds. The struggle between past and future, between backwardness and progress, between belief and science, superstition and knowledge, the wisdom of the heart and the knowledge of the brain, the dignity of the human individual and the herd instinct of the mass, between the faith in a higher destiny of humanity through inner development and the belief in material progress through an ever-increasing production of goods. All of us, all you students, in Sri Lanka, you've just gone through a civil war, which caused great destruction in your country. If you look around the world, the struggles that have been made manifest in our different traditions have been horrendous in their consequence. So these issues that we're grappling with, like today with Tibet, are deep issues. They affect everybody everywhere. Nobody's excluded in this conversation. And it's one of the great juxtapositions of the Tibetans through their Holocaust and the Jews through their Holocaust is that for the Jews, that ended their diaspora. They were expelled from the Eastern Mediterranean, what is now Israel and Palestine, 2,000 years ago by the Romans. In 168 AD, the Romans expelled all the Jews from Jerusalem. It was illegal on pain of death for a Jew to enter that part of the world, which had been their homeland. And for 2,000 years, they wandered. And after the Holocaust, they were given a homeland again. It was the opposite for the Tibetans. The Tibetans under the Dalai Lamas had really been philosopher kings. And Tibet, high in the Himalayan plateau, had produced a culture of such exquisite spirituality and nonviolence that it was unique, I would say, almost in the annals of history, of a people that for several centuries engaged in virtually no war, had no real army to speak of, not much even of a police force. 80% of their budget every year, the national budget, went to the monasteries. And they inculcated, instead of the young men going into the army in Tibet for 2.5 centuries, 20% of the population was either a monk or a nun. And they inculcated in the Tibetan culture such an exquisite spirit of nonviolence that even the little earthworms, if you've read Heydrich Hahr's book, 7 Years in Tibet, a German who was a prisoner of war and escaped the British camps in the Second World War, and he ended up in Tibet. He tells the story that he wanted to build a garden. And the Tibetans, when they were moving the earth so that he could plant some trees, when they would come across a little earthworm, they would stop and pick up the little earthworm and very carefully put them down outside the area, because they knew that that little earthworm could have been their mother in a previous incarnation. So the Tibetans, like the Jews, were completely unprepared for the Holocaust that came upon them by a superior military force with the explicit state policy of extermination. And one of the things that the Chinese communists did to the Tibetans, in addition to their mass slaughter, was that they forced the young Tibetan children in the new communist schools to go out and kill things, to kill little animals, to kill plants, and bring them to the classroom. So when we hear from Anarika Govinda that Tibet was an example par excellence of the struggle of modernity, in which all of us are being forced to make certain fundamental decisions about our lives, we have a sense of the power of a book like The Way of the White Clouds. And this book is really a pilgrimage story of a man that was fortunate enough to see Tibet, as I said, in its pristine purity before its decapitation as a country and the beginning of its diaspora. The Holocaust for the Jews produced a homeland and ended their diaspora. The Holocaust for Tibet expelled the Dalai Lama and hundreds of thousands of Tibetans from Tibet and began their diaspora, their journey in India. And now Tibetan Buddhism has now circumnavigated the world in a way that it never would have had they not been forced to endure what they experienced at the hands of the Chinese communists in the 1950s and 60s until the present day. And so The Way of the White Clouds is a story of his pilgrimage. And I want to say just a word about this notion of pilgrimage. And I want to accent this just for a moment before getting to Mount Kailash, because we offer pilgrimages at Ubiquity. We call them learning journeys, but we believe that many different ways of learning are important. So you're taking this course digitally. You're listening to me through Zoom, and you can see Mark Ryan on the screen. And as different ones of you speak, if you're on Zoom, you'll see your face on the screen. And that's a digital way. And we can do it very inexpensively because it's all by computer. It's all by the internet. But there's a layer above our digital learning at Ubiquity, and that's our learning journeys. So in July, we have a pilgrimage. We have a learning journey to Chartres in France. Also in July, in late July, we're going to Damanhur, a community in northern Italy. And then in August, we're going to Kailash, to Nepal and Tibet. We want all of you students to know that you're welcome to join any of these learning journeys, any of these pilgrimages. And I want to just read a short passage from the book here about what a pilgrimage is. Because you think, traveling from Sri Lanka to Italy and seeing the Vatican and the Sistine Chapel, and maybe going to the Louvre in Paris, and you're having a great trip and you feel like a tourist. That's one way to travel. But there's a deeper way to travel. And that's what a pilgrimage is. Pilgrimage is when you travel, but not from the point of view of what you see externally, but the movement of your soul, your spiritual development as you move through the external world. And he says the pilgrimage in the outer space is actually the mirrored reflection of an inner movement or development directed toward a yet unknown, distant aim, which, however, is intrinsically and seed-like contained in the very direction of that movement. Herefrom springs the readiness to cross the horizons of the known and the familiar, the readiness to accept people and new environments as part of our own destiny, and the confidence in the ultimate significance of all that happens and is in harmony with the depth of our being and the universality of a greater life. Just as the white summer cloud, in harmony with heaven and earth, freely floats in the blue sky from horizon to horizon, following the breath of the atmosphere, in the same way, the pilgrim abandons himself or herself to the breath of the greater life that wells up from the depth of his or her being and leads him or her beyond the farthest horizons to an aim which is already present within, yet hidden from sight. And that's the way of the white cloud. The cloud represents the creative power of the mind, which can assume any imaginable form, because it's the ideal medium of creation for the enlightened or the enraptured mind. The cloud in Tibetan Buddhism means the body of delight. So this book is The Way of the White Clouds. It's the body of delight. It's the inner journey of a wisp of atmosphere, condensed with humidity so we can see it as it wafts across the sky. That's what our lives are like. We're momentary, ephemeral essences, here for just a flicker of a moment. And then we move on to an onward journey of the transmigration of our soul, as we'll discuss next time. So the pilgrimage of Anarika Govinda and his wife really culminated in their circumambulation of Mount Kailash in eastern central Tibet. And I just want to, again, read a few passages just so we have the delight of his language, but also to get at a deeper level of awareness that sometimes a tree is a tree, and sometimes a tree is more than a tree. Sometimes a mountain is just a mountain. And other times, to the pilgrim's eye, a mountain is more than a mountain. So he has a whole chapter on the sacred mountain. And he writes, there are mountains which are just mountains. And there are mountains with personality. Think about that. There are mountains with personality. The personality of a mountain is more than merely a strange shape that makes it different from others. Just as a strangely shaped face or strange actions do not make an individual into a personality. Personality, says Govinda, consists in the power to influence others. And this power is due to consistency, harmony, and one-pointedness of character. If these qualities are present in an individual in their highest perfection, then this individual is a fit leader of humanity, either as a ruler or thinker or saint. And we recognize that person as a vessel of divine power. Think about that for a second. Who are you influenced by? You're influenced by people with great personalities, big personalities. That's what's happening in the United States with Donald Trump. The United States is being confronted by a very big personality that's breaking all the political rules. Now, what that means for America and for the world will be determined over the next several months. But when you think of personality, you think of politicians, you think of a teacher, you think of a friend, someone with a bigger than life personality, they influence everything around them. And what Govinda is saying is that's not true of people. That's true of animals. That's true of trees and birds. And it's true in particular, in his case, of mountains. And the power of such a mountain is so great and yet so subtle that without compulsion, people are drawn to it far and wide, as if by the force of some invisible magnet. And they will undergo untold hardships and privations in their inexplicable urge to approach and to worship the center of this sacred power. Even though you don't understand the nature of a personality, but you feel attracted to that person. You want to be with that person. The same is true of certain mountains, certain holy sites. People just start to go. Every country has certain sacred sites, and people just go there. Why do they go there? Because there's this magnetic pull that draws people, even though they don't understand it. And somehow as they go to that sacred site, that temple, that mound, that river, that tree, they somehow feel cleansed by the experience of going just in the presence of that mountain. And so nobody confers the title of sacredness on such a mountain. And yet everybody recognizes it. Nobody has to defend its claim because nobody doubts it. Nobody has to organize its worship because people are overwhelmed by the mere presence of such a mountain and cannot express their feelings other than by worship. One is not motivated with the urge to conquer such a mountain. Instead of conquering it, the religious-minded person prefers to be conquered by the mountain. We open our soul to its spirit and allow it to take possession of us, because only those who are inspired or possessed by the divine spirit can partake in its nature. And that's what makes certain mountains divine symbols. Kailash is a mountain of mountains. There's no other mountain, he says, comparable to Kailash, because it forms the hub of the two most important ancient civilizations of the world. Traditions which have remained intact for thousands of years, in fact, by many orders of magnitude. The oldest civilizations in the world have collectively without any conflict between them, honored Mount Kailash in Tibet as the most sacred spot in the world, as the metaphysical center of the world, as Mount Meru in both the Buddhist and the Hindu traditions. And it corresponds in that understanding with the spinal column, our backbone. So that Mount Kailash is in some ways the backbone of planet Earth. It's surmounted by an invisible temple of the highest transcendental power, even as at the top of our spinal column is our brain. So on the top of Mount Kailash is the transcendental power of the invisible worlds. For the Hindus, Kailash is the seat of Shiva. For the Buddhists, Kailash represents a gigantic mandala, the mandala of highest bliss. And so if you look at even the geography of the Himalayan range, Kailash stands unique among the mighty mountains of the Himalaya. It's part of the spire of the Himalayan range. So it's part of the backbone of the Himalayas, as well as being the backbone of the earth. And 4 of the 8 major rivers of Asia, the Brahmaputra, the Indus, the Karnali, and the Sutlej, all come from underneath Mount Kailash. Think about that for a minute. There are 8 major rivers of Asia. The Indus and the Brahmaputra come, and 2 others come from right underneath Mount Kailash. And these rivers are described as outlets from the Lake Manasaravar, right at the southern base of Mount Kailash, are 2 lakes. And it's said that the rivers circulate the mountain 7 times and then flow to water the Asian subcontinent. And there's other things that I could say, but I want to just dwell on the perfect symmetry of Kailash. The 2 lakes at the southern base of Kailash represent the sun, Lake Manasaravar, and the moon, Lake Rakastal. So the solar and the lunar, the masculine and the feminine, are there very present in this most sacred of mountains. And it's worth noting that Manasaravar comes with a root Sanskrit meaning manas, which means consciousness. And Rakas, for Lake Rakastal, means demon. So you have the light, the solar, the darker, more demonic forces in the cosmos that are there right at the base of Mount Kailash, around which the 4 of the 8 great rivers of Asia circumnavigate the sacred mountain and then flow into the Asian plain. And this represents the 2 streams or currents of psychic energy. So as Mount Kailash corresponds to the spinal column, it represents also the axis of the spiritual universe arising through innumerable world planes, from the human up to the divine. And it's according to Buddhist legend that the birth of the Buddha is connected with Lake Manasaravar, because according to this tradition, Queen Maya, his mother, dreamt that the couch on which she rested was borne by the guardian gods of Lake Manasaravar, and she was bathed in its sacred waters, whereupon all human impurities were removed from her, so that the future Buddha could be born in absolute perfection in the womb of her mother, of his mother. And so just think about that, dreaming of woman, dreaming of Lake Manasaravar, being bathed by the waters of that sacred lake, so that her womb was perfect. And then the Buddha was waiting in the invisible realm, the invisible temple above the mountain. And he descended from the direction of Mount Kailash and entered into her side, according to the legend, as a white elephant. And then he was born some months later. What an extraordinary understanding of the power of a mountain to influence human destiny and human history. Arguably the greatest mind in the world, the Buddha, certainly among the greatest, was deeply associated with Mount Kailash. And then in the Hindu tradition, it was Brahma himself who created Lake Manasaravar and the divine Lambu tree through the invisible realms. And it is said by both the Buddhist and the Hindu traditions that it is out of Lake Manasaravar, the great solar round lake, that right at the center of the lake rises the tree of life and the Lambu. And it's the lake of supreme consciousness. And out of the lake arises this great tree, and the tree has leaves of every imaginable color. All the rainbow colors are in that tree. And at the center of every leaf is a lotus blossom. And sitting on the lotus blossom are all the great spiritual teachers and avatars and gurus and masters that have ever lived. And so when one contemplates Mount Kailash, one contemplates Lake Manasaravar, one is really contemplating the epicenter of the great civilizations of China and Asia and the Buddhist and the Hindu traditions. And it is said that Shiva himself, the great god Shiva, dwells in that holy mountain. And in addition to that, Avalokitesvara, the god of compassion, is also dwells around Mount Kailash. And in fact, as the pilgrims do the great circumambulation of the mountain, which takes about 3 days, the highest pass on the northern side of the mountain is the Great Tara Pass. And Tara, as you all may know, is the feminine embodiment of compassion. And Kuan Yin, Tara, the great feminine embodiment of Avalokitesvara, the god of compassion. So you have that masculine and feminine aspects always present around Kailash. And that's where we're going in August. And I really want to invite everybody on this call that if it's considered the ultimate pilgrimage. As far as anyone knows, it's never been climbed. Even the Chinese communists don't allow anybody to climb Mount Kailash, such as its sacredness. It's probably the oldest sacred site possibly known in history. People have been going to Mount Kailash since long before Hinduism and Buddhism emerged. It's just one of those places. And, if you think of Mount Everest, for example, Mount Everest is the result of mountains on top of mountains on top of mountains, and then you get Mount Everest. Kailash is completely unique. it stands alone in a plain. And there's a circle of mountains around it, but then they dip down into a plain, and out of the plain emerges Mount Kailash, and it's perfectly sculpted. And at its peak, it actually looks like the Pyramid of Giza. It's a four-sided pyramid coming to a beautiful, beautiful point. And pilgrims have been attracted, again, this notion of the personality of a mountain and the great effect of mountains. And I would say trees. Remember, it was the Buddha that gained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. And when it came time for him to die, he selected a tree under which he had his last teaching and took his last breath before he entered what they call parinirvana. And so I want to close there, and we'll open it up for dialogue. But let me just summarize the discussion for today. And that is to say that when we contemplate these great books, we're dealing with issues that are very deep. And I hope that in the few minutes we've had just thinking about Anarika Govinda's pilgrimages in Tibet, the spirit of the white cloud wafting across the sky, you felt some kind of a movement in your heart about what your own destiny is, about a deeper pursuit of meaning. And the reason why I accentuated the destruction of Tibet, the Holocaust of Tibet, the dispersal of the Tibetan people now around the world, is to say that, you know, these great works and the depth of a human life very seldom takes place far removed from the travails and the agony of human history. The great personalities of our traditions have not emerged in an atmosphere of ease. I imagine every life of every person on this call is comprised of contradictions, challenges, and opportunities embedded in our contradictions that, if we pursue them in the spirit of pilgrimage, remember, you can be a tourist to Rome. You could even be a tourist to Mount Kailash. But the opportunity of a true student is to allow the external situation, whatever it is, even if it's the destruction of your own people, to illuminate the interior of your soul so that you feel your life more deeply. And out of the contradictions of the situation in which you seek escape, you're forced to a deeper resonance with a deeper truth that is holding even the contradictions in a harmonious whole, as your white cloud of your life floats across the sky. So I'll end it there and turn it over to Mark, and then call on various of you to speak. And as Dan said at the beginning, you know, if you want to make a contribution, just raise your hand, and I'll try to master the controls. Daniel probably have to identify who's raising their hand. I'm not sure I can see it. Dan's our great maestro on these matters. So Mark, please. And by the way, let me introduce Mark Ryan, for those of you who don't know him, he's one of the faculty here at the Wisdom School. He was took his PhD in American literature at Yale University, and then was at Yale for many, many years as a dean of one of the colleges there and faculty, and then went down into Mexico and taught down in Mexico, and is a man of very deep both philosophical and historical experience. We're very honored to have Dr. Ryan as part of our faculty, and he's been one of my co-faculty for the great books from the beginning, actually. So you'll probably be taking a course or two from Mark before you're finished with Ubiquity. So Mark, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much, Jim. And thank you for that powerful introduction to this book. I love the book, I must say. It was just a delight to read. I didn't know of it before you suggested it, although I do have, as I'll mention in a moment, some modest background with Tibetan Buddhism. But it was a wonderful thing to read. Shows what a marvelous opportunity you're offering folks with the trip to Mount Kailash, and certainly you gave us a beautiful context for it. And picking up on some of your remarks right at the end there, I know the Dalai Lama himself has suggested that there may be some greater intelligence beyond his own exile and the Tibetan diaspora, that there's a way in which this tragedy has brought the beauty of this culture with all its riches that it can offer the rest of the world into modernity, really, into our more modern life. And I confess that being a product of modernity, my interests are especially in how this experience in Tibet and this Tibetan delving into the deeper layers of consciousness can really help leaven the issues in our modern world. And I'd like to just, if I may, give a little bit of a personal story here in why I feel that is of such importance in the Tibetan experience, and the deeper elements of Tibetan culture are very significant for the rest of us. I've had the honor of being in the presence of His Holiness the Dalai Lama a number of times, and beginning with a pilgrimage of my own to Dharamsala, the seat of his monastery and where he lives in Himachal Pradesh in northern India. And in that first visit, which was there, I was so struck with the effect of his presence on everyone around me, and myself included. You mentioned the importance of personality, and being in the presence of that personality just has a powerful effect on people around, and it can be anybody. I mean, he's had that effect in the United States Congress, just with people who otherwise would have very little knowledge of his world. And my most powerful experience of that was when I had the honor of playing host to him personally at Yale University, where I had, on the basis of my Dharamsala experience and the people we met there, I had invited him to Yale. And lo and behold, within a couple of years, he took us up on the invitation. And I had the honor of escorting him around personally for 2 days. And it was, this was in 1992, so he was not as widely known as he is now. Most of my Yale students, bright as they are, had very little concept of Tibetan culture, or certainly Tibetan Buddhism, and the Dalai Lama himself. And I had enough experience with him to know that he has the most powerful presence in small groups, fairly small group. So I had arranged for a select number of we did it by lot, people to meet with him in the living room of the master's house. And quite honestly, those students really didn't know what to expect. Some of them had prepared quite intelligent questions about the political situation of Tibet and so forth. But they were very nervous before meeting him. You could sense it in the room. And then he came through the doors there. And he just looked at the people. There was this silence in the room, this nervousness. What are we going to do? Is this supposed to be a god or a king or whatever? And he could sense all that. He just picked it up, and he just laughed. And he said, I know that I appear very different, but I know that if we can have a conversation as one person to another, we will have a very good time. And the tension in that room just flew out of the window. It was gone. And within seconds, those students were laughing at his feet. They were joking. They were asking him about what he really felt about reincarnation in a way that he took in with the greatest love and humor. And he could, you could just see how he delighted being in their presence. And it was, as he himself said, very much about his meeting them, not just them meeting him. And I have a couple of, I wrote up that experience in a book once, and I just have a couple of student quotations I wanted to mention, if I can put my hands on them right away. One of them was just talking about how you could just feel how he embodied to the fullest what he spoke about. And another one said, as soon as people met him, they completely relaxed. He diffused tension wherever he went. He possesses a kind of warmth and kindness that is so genuine. As soon as people meet him, they're in some ways transformed. That's not his word, but I had the experience myself towards the end of that day he was giving a big talk in a big auditorium at Yale, and he at the end of it he was just acknowledging the applause as he does, just bowing, and I could. There was a moment in which I felt, my personal experience was, I felt a physical jolt. It was like an electric charge, just right physically into my body. And I could swear that he had stopped and just looked right at me. And later on, somebody more knowledgeable person in this tradition told me that, yes, that's a Shakti pot. It happens with great frequency around a guru. But later I went through videos of the end of that talk and looking for his pause in that acknowledgement. And it wasn't there. It was all my experience of him. He was not particularly singling me out. It's just, and that's my little window personally into what I've sensed in these various other encounters I've had with him as the tremendous power of the personality that you might attribute to being a reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, or whatever it may be. But there are other ways to frame it as. But however you frame it, it's evident that it's a product of millennia, really, of Tibetan Buddhist culture and practices in delving into, I think, the deepest layers of consciousness, where you go beyond even the evil of the human world and really sense how the human and divine ultimately are one. Next time I'll have some remarks, I think, on some of how this Tibetan embodiment can be explained some in terms of modern consciousness. But I'd like to stop there and hear what some of your students have to say. Thanks, Jim. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mark. And that's worth contemplating next time, everyone, is the effect of the personality of a guru. When you have that jolt of Shakti, you know, what gives rise to it, and how the subjective experience of the recipient, in Mark's case, unbelievably real. But when you look at the videos, it does not appear to be as explicit as the subjective experience would indicate, but that doesn't make it any less real. What is that mysterious aspect of the relationship with the personality and the etheric body of a great guru, particularly in the case of the Dalai Lama, which is the 14th reincarnation of a single intelligence and spirit. And I don't know whether we'll have time to go into the phenomenon of the Dalai Lama and the reincarnation of these great spiritual masters. But maybe if we have time next month, we'll touch on that, because it's certainly part of the reincarnation, the transmigration of the soul, which is widely believed in all the Asian traditions. So thank you for that, and we'll go more deeply into it next month. So I want to turn, we have about 15 minutes left. I want to just turn to our students. Is there anyone, there's one person with their hand up. You're on, Lily.
Hello there. I was thinking so much of what you were saying and about us being a cloud, a waft across the sky, and our life being so swift. And I loved that. And what I was thinking also is you were talking about the destruction in Tibet, and you were the destruction of the Jewish peoples, the Holocaust, all of these things. These things happened in the United States as well with our indigenous people. And what survived? The great personality of Black Elk, the great personalities that brought their spiritual life to us. That was that's what's brought into us from the other culture, is their spiritual life. And Gustafson wrote a wonderful book on it, Dancing Between Two Worlds, and where he talks about that movie, Dancing with the Wolves, and how we, in our sorrow that we have imposed this on a peoples, that we have, what have we taken back from them to help us forgive ourselves, but their philosophy, their spiritual world. And so I'm really, really connected with what you're saying about this book and how it connects with personality and the spiritual world and our growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. And it's worth noting and emphasizing that the Holocaust, really, of the Native American peoples here in North America was of equal devastation to what the Jews experienced in their Holocaust and the Tibetans in their Holocaust. And again, going back to Govinda's original point, with which he starts the book, is that in Tibet and others, there's this great contradiction between two philosophies. And what emerges at the other end is when the conqueror learns from the spirituality of the conquered, and through the spirituality of the conquered understands the depravity of his own destructiveness and gains not only deeper understanding but self-forgiveness through that highly paradoxical and nuanced contradictory process. So that's a very important point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that Holocaust, by the way, of the native peoples in North America continues to the present day. And the US government has never once apologized for what it's done for the native peoples and continues the genocide in very subtle cultural ways as they're compelled onto their reservations and subjected to unspeakable criminality, which includes, just so we're all staying current here, the abduction of native children so that they can be brought up in the white culture that exists today in 2016 in the United States of America. So there's deep lessons for all of us in what we've witnessed in Tibet. So for that, deep learnings. So let's move on.
I have sort of an indirect connection to Lama Govinda that I mentioned to you previously. If you remember in the book, Lama Govinda talks about being the Shela to Tomo Geshe Rinpoche. One of my major mentors, George Rossner in Toronto, was the Shela to Lama Govinda. And hence I had an indirect exposure to the magnificence of Lama Govinda in the combination of intelligence and compassion that I encountered in George Rossner. Unfortunately, he died just after I had completed my training as a Gestalt therapist. So I no longer had that direct relationship with a man that I deeply loved. The other thing that I wanted to touch upon is that there's been a number of books that have deeply influenced me in the last few months. One was one of the books of the recent intensive, the book Future Primal, which is the story of the Zan Bushmen of Africa and the recognition that they were one of the oldest and the most authentic of democracies in our world, and yet almost totally unrecognized. The second is a book that you mentioned at that intensive, The Parable of the Tribes, which for me is although it's 40 years old, is a profound exploration of the relationship between power and civilization. And what does a culture do when a surrounding culture becomes aggressive? And one choice is extinction. One choice is to be overcome, as the Tibetan people were. And then the third book that I haven't finished reading, but is a book called AD 381, with the subtitle Heretics, Pagans, and the Christian State. It's the story of the edict of Theodosius I in 381, which transformed the freedom of discussion within the Greek world into an absolute intolerance of any other interpretation other than that provided by the church. So again, a profound reflection on how power distorts. And I end up with the eternal question that I have of how do we as a species mature to the point where we learn to cooperate with each other? And we're nowhere near that at the present time, particularly as illustrated by the current politics in the United States. Anyway, my contribution.
Well, thank you, Dave. And just on some of this, and I see we're only have about 5 minutes left, that I'd love to hear, I don't know, Madhushika, are you with us? Love to hear Madhushika. She's from Sri Lanka. She was our first student from Sri Lanka. If you want to raise your hand, I'd love to hear from you. But while you're preparing yourself or thinking about what you might want to say, I want to touch on what Dave McQuarrie just mentioned, because I think it's significantly important. It's worth noting, if you juxtapose Jerusalem in the west with Mount Kailash in the east, that there's probably been more blood shed between the Jews and Christians and Muslims around Jerusalem. And as far as anyone knows, there's not been a single drop of blood shed between the Hindus and the Buddhists and the other traditions around Mount Kailash. The level of religious bloodshed in the West around the notion of orthodoxy and belief and power is 1,000 times more than any bloodshed. Bloodshed in the East around religious rivalry is rare. It's not non-existent, but it's very rare. And so I think one of the things that's called up by Mount Kailash, to compare it with Jerusalem, is it's well worth considering the different approaches and the different results of the different metaphysical traditions around the world on this question of power, orthodoxy, and violence. But I see Madhu with us. Welcome. I'm glad we've been able, Madhu, to have this at a time. And I just want to acknowledge Madhu Shika here for a moment. Last trimester, she had to get up at 3:30 in the morning to do our great book. So we've rearranged the time, Madhu, for you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yes, I'm so glad about the changing of the time and really appreciate it. Thank you so much for the change of the time. It will be convenient for me and all the other Sri Lankan students as well. Thank you so much for that.
So do you have a comment on the remarks or the discussion of the way of the white clouds today? Anything you want to say?
Yeah, a small thing I want to ask Professor. Now, you mentioned something regarding that cloud means greater power of mind. So what do you exactly mean now? What do you mean by this white cloud? If you could give me a brief briefing about that thing. Cloud means the greater power of mind. So what do you mean by this white cloud?
Yes, that's a good question. Thank you. And it's I'll refer back to Govinda on this. The notion of the white cloud in the Buddhist tradition and also the Hindu tradition has to do with understanding both the effervescence, the very transitory nature of our human existence. We're here for just a brief moment and then we float away. So the white cloud, the image of the white cloud, like the image of a rainbow, really speaks to the transitory nature of human existence, but also more deeply, as he points out, the white cloud in the Buddhist tradition represents the creative power of the mind, which can assume any imaginable form. So a white cloud, especially a cloud shining in delicate rainbow colors. You sometimes see clouds in the sky and they have some of the colors of the rainbow. What that means in Buddhist and Hindu traditions is very beautiful. It represents the creativity of the mind and is regarded as the ideal medium of creation for the enlightened or the enraptured soul. So when you think of the clouds, clouds can take any shape. You think of your mind can go into any creative direction. And yet it's all effervescent. It's here for a moment, and then it's gone. So the way of the white clouds is a symbol of both human existence, the possibilities of human creativity and imagination going in any direction. And that's why they refer to the white clouds, the mind created in the spirit of the white clouds. They call it the body of delight. The body of delight.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much for that explanation.
Well, good. That's probably the best way to close out this call. And I'll just read a sentence or two. He says, "Thus the white cloud becomes the symbol of the guru's wisdom and compassion." Going back to Mark, he had this Shaktipat. And yet when he looked at the video, the Dalai Lama wasn't looking at him. That's the white cloud. That's the effervescence of the experience. That's the wisdom of the guru. And therefore the way of the white clouds hints at the same time at the way of spiritual unfoldment, the way of a pilgrimage that leads to the realization of final completion, which comes out of our realization of human beings, that we're transitory phenomena like clouds. And in the brief moment in which we are the rainbow clouds, we have the possibility of understanding our harmony with the sky. So that's a nice note upon which to end our call. We will continue next month, and we will dive into Anarika Govinda's understanding of reincarnation and the transmigration of the soul, and the Buddhist understanding of consciousness. So thank you all for joining. Don't forget, part of the assignment of this class is you have to show up on our Facebook page. We'll have a recording of this in the next day or two that we'll put up on the Facebook page, send out to everybody. And then we'll meet always on the second Tuesday of every month for the next lecture. And then that'll take us to June. And then in July and August, Mark Ryan, your faculty, and he'll be delving into another one of the great books, this one from the West. Then after Mark, I'll be back with another book from the East, the Analects of Confucius. And so we're delighted to be able to have all of us together. So thank you all, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.
Bye.